Alright, let us return to our demo and replace the use of the hard-coded data with real data. We'll therefore bring in support for the HTTP client. We'll create a new data service and we'll use that from our master and detail page. Everything is now configured. We have our API project now will host our Blazor application. Time to now use that API from our Blazor application and get rid of this mock data, right? And we're going to reach out to the API endpoints using the HTTP client. And there are in fact two ways, like I mentioned in the slides, to do so. The easiest, but definitely not always the best way, is injecting the HTTP client directly inside of the component. Using the code that you see here, where I'm injecting an HTTP client into the component, we get access to that HTTP client and can use it to make a request to an API endpoint. Using the inject attribute, I'm going to inject it here. This is dependency injection at work. The HTTP client can be configured in the program class, and then an instance of the HTTP client will be injected directly in the component. With this HTTP client instance injected, we could use the following code that you see here. We can reach out to our API endpoint using the getFromJSON async. The argument is the endpoint, so the URI of the endpoint, and automatically this getFromJSON async method, so one of the built-in methods, will convert this into a list of employees. For this to work, as mentioned, we also need to configure the HTTP client in the program class. Although this works, I'm not really a fan of using the HTTP client directly in my components. I'd rather have my components be lightweight and have them rely on another class to make the actual HTTP calls. And that's what I'm going to do here, and then we'll also use the HTTP client factory, which is, in my opinion, a more elegant approach to using the HTTP client. So I'm going to remove this code again here. I will use the HTTP client factory-based approach. So as said, I'm going to create classes that will contain all the logic to reach out to our API. So I'm going to go and create a new folder where I'll place these classes. For now, it will be just one, and that'll be the services folder. In there, I'll create the iEmployee data service. That'll be an interface that'll contain the definitions of the method I want to implement, and I'll need for the HTTP communication. So I'll add here the iEmployee data service as a class, and I'll make this into an interface, and I will define on there the methods that we will need. Let me add the correct using statement. I've defined the getAllEmployees, which will be returning me an enumerable of employees asynchronously, so I have defined it to be a task. I have the getEmployeeDetails, which accepts an employee ID. I have an add, an update, and a delete employee method as well. Those correspond, of course, with the API endpoints defined on our controller. These will indeed be the methods that reach out to those API endpoints. So let's create the implementation. Add a class here again, and that will be the employee data service. And that will, of course, implement the iEmployee data service interface. And let's already create a default implementation here. There we go. I will add the implementation for these in just a minute. Let us now first go to our program class. And there we'll need to make the necessary registrations. I will register with my dependency injection container that when an iEmployee data service is requested, an employee data service instance will be retrieved. But that will, when we create the implementation, require an HTTP client, and we can use the HTTP client factory to do this. We can in fact register using the add_HTTP_client method, an interface with its implementation, and if that class needs an HTTP client, an instance will be injected automatically. That is the typed way of doing things. Now before we can use the HTTP client factory, we need to add a NuGet package. I'm going to go and right click on my project and say Manage NuGet Packages. Click on Browse and search for the Microsoft Extensions HTTP package. Click on Install. That will bring that package into our application. There we go. And now we can actually do what I just said. So now we're going to register the iEmployee data service and its implementation, the employee data service. Normally we would use a method that comes with a dependency injection container like add_scoped or add_transient, but now we'll use the add_HTTP_client method, which as you can see here, comes from the iHttp client factory. And that will then inject into the class, the employee data service in our case, the necessary HTTP client. Of course, we need to bring in a correct using statement. And the client is also configured here, as you can see. We're specifying that the client's base address will be the builder.hostenvironment.base address. Indeed, we just need to go to the hosting environment, which is our API, and use that base address, so localhost 7039 in my case. So now with the registration in place, let's now go back to our employee data service. And in here, I'm now going to use constructor injection to get an instance of the HTTP client injected. That comes from the HttpClient factory. So first, let's bring in a read-only instance of the HTTP client. And I like the suggested name here. And let's also use IntelliSense to create the constructor. So as said, this HTTP client instance will be injected because we registered here using the @HTTpClient. So we're using the typed approach here. Now I can actually create the implementations of my methods. Let's first focus on the getAllEmployees. I'm going to remove the throw here, and I'm also going to make this async. Let's bring in the correct using statements. There we go. Now what happens here? Well, I've used the HTTP client to make a request to API/employee. I also pass it some options so that it's case insensitive. That response, which is going to be JSON of course, will be deserialized using the JSON serializer.deserialize async, and we will deserialize into an IEnumerable of employees. So that means that we'll get back all employees here. Let's do pretty much the same for the getEmployeeDetails, which receives an employee ID. So in here, I'll now make a request to API/employee/the ID of the employee, and I'll deserialize now into a single employee. We'll add an implementation for the add, delete, and update later on. All right, we now have our implementation ready of our data service. Let us now go back to our component. Let's first head over to the employee overview. All right, so now in the component, I'm going to get rid of this onInitialized, which was still using the mock data service. I'm now going to inject an instance of my iEmployee data service. This we still need to inject. Dependency injection inside of the component uses the inject attribute. It doesn't work with constructor injection here. We have to use the inject attribute. And so I'm going to inject here an iEmployee data service, which we registered with our dependency injection container here, so my application knows about it. Now I'm going to override the onInitialized async. Communication with the API will run in an asynchronous way. We've also defined that our methods are async, they're task-based. So I'm going to use the onInitialized async here. What am I going to do here? I'm going to say now that employees is in fact going to come from invoking on our employee data service instance that we get through dependency injection, the getAllEmployees. And that is expecting it to be a list, so we'll call toList. I'll need to make the same changes on the employee detail, so let me do that quickly here and show you the result. Here is the updated employee detail component. Again, through the inject attribute, I'm injecting an iEmployee data service, which will be an employee data service, and that I use to then call the getEmployeeDetails, passing in the employee ID. All right, time for the big moment. Let's see if we can use our API from a Blazor application. Let's click on employees. And there we go. We now see one employee. That's the employee that is coming back from the API. And let's make sure that everything still works. So let's navigate to the employee detail. And effectively, we also see the detail page working. So now we're using data coming from an API.